He's Howard Eibach, a former copywriter and creative director and the author of 2 books on the creative brief.
And he's Henry Gomez, an ad agency strategist with 28 years of experience. Together, Henry and I are the Brief Brothers. We love talking about creative briefs, briefing, and advertising. Henry, today we have a special guest. His name is Neal Foard. A lot of folks out in the social media world know who he is. He's an old friend of mine. He'll tell us more about who he is and what he's doing these days. Let's join the conversation. Okay, Henry, we're back with another episode today. I am delighted to welcome an old friend, and I am seeing him now live and in person for the first time in a long, long time. His name is Neal Foard. If you watch YouTube, LinkedIn, TikTok, etc., this is a familiar face. I've always wanted to say a man who needs no introduction, but I'm going to introduce him anyway. I've known him for about a dozen years or more. When I met him, he was a creative director at Saatchi, and now he is what I like to call the Garrison Keillor of YouTube and LinkedIn. His name is Neal Foard. Neal, welcome to the Brief Brothers. We're delighted to have you.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate the chance to see you again, Howard, and it's nice to meet you, Henry. And I'm looking forward to this conversation.
We are too. Well, Neal's evolved from a creative director and copywriter. I believe you were a copywriter.
That's right. Yep.
And he was in the business for, decades.
Yep.
And now he's doing some really interesting things. We're going to let him tell us more about that. But we like to begin conversations with our guests, Neal, by asking you to tell us a little bit about your background. So, for example, what attracted you to advertising? Was there an event, a book, a conversation, something that happened that said, I think this is really, really what I want to do? How did that get started? And then kind of give us the trajectory of your career and to where you are today.
I was working in the lumber business in a lumber yard in South Central LA. And it was one of these things where you're just vibrating with frustration about what your daily life is like. And I literally quit, and on that day realized I was going to have trouble making the rent. So I called everyone I knew and asked if they knew where I could, like they knew any job openings. And the first response I got was from somebody who was leaving Saatchi & Saatchi, which at the time was Dancer Fitzgerald Sample in Torrance. And they said, if you can show up for an interview here tomorrow, I think I could have you replace me before they post the job opening. So that's how I wound up in advertising. It was the first job.
What was the job posting?
It was an assistant account executive working in general services for Saatchi on the Toyota business. And I used to do things like, assistant account executives, we were on the clock all the time. I mean, we were in the office at 7:30 and we usually didn't leave until 10:30, 11. And you were hustling all day long. There wasn't a single overweight person in that department because we were running that staircase all day and all night, 5 floors top to bottom. And then one of those crazy Christmases, they had this party, the company Christmas party had as its theme that people were going to enter lip sync videos to, like, music videos were really big back then. So everybody was doing these music videos and, mimicking Janet Jackson and so forth. And I used to hang out with the guys from the mailroom, and we thought it would be hysterically funny to do a kind of weird documentary about the greatest musician you've never heard of. And it was this kooky, it was really surreal, where an A&R man from Atlantic Records goes out to Bakersfield to check out this band who has this crazy good singer. And we dubbed the entire thing in Italian. And then so the whole thing was recorded in English, but then we got rid of that and we dubbed it in Italian. And then we retracked it with subtitles, and everybody played the Italian accents that we would do. Everybody chose some other character. So instead of me being my voice, I would be the guy from the mailroom and the guy, et cetera. And the basic story goes that I come out to see this guy. I'm the A&R man. We come out to see this musician. The band is rocking and they're getting ready with this big intro, and it's fantastic. And the singer is so drunk they had to wake him up by pouring water on him. So they threw this big bucket of water on him. He grabs the microphone, electrocutes himself, and at the end of it, I go, this is the greatest act I've ever seen in my life. I want him to open for the Talking Heads in 3 weeks, but he's stone dead. And at this point, my cohort from the mailroom just looks down and goes, anybody got any gum? And that was the end of it was called Mailroom Johnny and the Big Shots. And it was so weird and awesome. It was something, I mean, it was like watching a Fellini movie. And the creative director of the agency said, what the hell are you doing as an assistant account executive? Come work for me. So that's how I made the transition.
So you wrote, I imagine, came up with the idea and wrote it, and really were the driving force behind it.
Yeah, kind of, sort of.
And how long had you been on staff as the assistant account executive?
About a year.
So the transition didn't take long.
No, it's a funny thing, Howard, but you guys can probably remember the old days of advertising. It was a vastly different business from what it is now. It was possible to have a mentor and for people to cultivate you and look after you. And there was time to go have a beer with people. And I had one mentor who was, like I say, the hours were ferocious. And I think I was literally losing my mind, because the guy who actually helped me make the transition to the creative department, he pulled me aside one day and says, I think you're going crazy. And I go, I know. And he goes, no, I'm dead serious. I think you're losing your mind a little bit. You're acting funny. And I think you need to take the day off tomorrow. This guy was not my boss. He goes, take the day off tomorrow and I'll ride. What do you call it? I'll be your wingman on this. I'll claim that you're doing something for me. And I remember that so distinctly, being like, it was an agency where people would look out for you like that, like they would take care of you.
Well, I worked for a sister agency. I worked for Team One.
Oh yeah.
Different time frame. Was there in the mid 90s, 96, 97, 98, 99, something like that.
Yeah.
And I worked for Scott Gilbert. He was the CEO at Team One, along with
the very guy that I said was saying, I think you're going crazy and you should take the day off. That was Scott Gilbert.
Yeah, Scott. And that sounds like Scott. That's
the
kind of person Scott is, or was.
He's fabulous. He's still around. He's still being an awesome dude. He's in
Colorado now, isn't he?
Yeah, he's in very close to Aspen. And he used to run the Roaring Fork Habitat for Humanity up there.
Yes,
and he used to
did.
do their store, and he was teaching at community college, and he was helping kids get scholarships to school. He's still an amazing dude.
He really is amazing. So you didn't have a traditional portfolio then. You made the
No, I never in my career did I have a portfolio. I didn't.
That's remarkable. I mean, because we talk about that all the time. It's like, I was trying to put together a portfolio to get into the business. I struggled for a long time. I didn't even get my first ad job until I was 30. And one of the things that Henry and I talk about is how many of us, especially in the creative side, but strategy is also an example of people who fall accidentally into our business.
I don't know if that still happens. I know it happened a lot back when we were jumping into the biz. Things have changed so radically, for the worse. And I think that the quality of advertising now it isn't the art form that it once was. And there was a heyday of the British strategic planners who would just come up with the greatest strategies and briefs. And they would isolate these magnificent points to make. And I remember there was the Australians as well, right? Because the Australians and the Americans, Canadians and New Zealanders. And I remember
they were the only ones really who got any kind of training around planning, which is now strategy. If you were part of the Commonwealth, that was part of your training.
Yeah, it definitely was. And I remember seeing a couple of pieces of advertising and just going, oh my God, that is just so quintessentially coming out of that brief. You can just feel it coming out of the brief. And it was just these ludicrous pieces of fantastic silliness for Pepe jeans. And an example would be some guy is scratching his head. He's going, Pepe jeans, Pepe. And he keeps scratching his head until finally just a jet of blood starts going out of his head. And then it goes, Pepe jeans, we haven't heard of you either. You can just feel the brief right on that one. And
well, there's also a difference in the audience. I think the Brits and then Commonwealth people who lived and migrated to the Commonwealth countries were trained by the advertising agencies to expect better quality creative. So the audience who would watch on television, listen on the radio, read magazines and newspapers had a higher expectation of creativity than Americans. We expect to see stories about works harder. It's filled with things. We're going to tell you all the facts about this product. We're going to tell you what kind of value it is. It's a great price.
The booster. Americans are great boosters. You know, we just don't see any vulgarity in just coming right on and asking for a date. You know who else is fabulous, different, but likewise their creative is extraordinary, is the Thais. Thailand creativity is extraordinary. I had it explained to me. I don't know if this is really why, but I had it explained to me this way, that most of Asia has a very, very large colonial influence. Hong Kong, for example, is very English. And forever they are always imitating the English in order to be better than them. And then likewise, you'll see it again and again in other cultures that were colonized. But the Thais were never colonized. About the closest they came to being colonized was there was a big German influence, but the Thais have always been Thai with no outside cultural overlord. And as a result, they are perfectly comfortable being themselves. And so much of their advertising in the 90s, late 90s and aughts was crazy cool. Just amaze balls. And like they would show an ad for it was Petronas was the big Malaysian oil company. I forget what the Thai version of that was, but they would feature this ad where a Godzilla-like figure was ransacking Bangkok, and everybody was out in the street in abject terror. And this Godzilla figure comes up and is just about to bake a little girl with his fire breath. And the little girl looks up at him and he goes, and nothing comes out.
I remember this.
Oh, you remember this ad? And then all you could see is the little pilot light in the middle of his throat.
Yeah.
And the little girl goes, and it goes out. And now he's furious. And so he goes to one of these filling stations and picks up a gas pump from the brand of oil this is thing, and he drinks it down and then goes on another rampage. And then eventually, but what he's doing is just before he finally, after having drunk the gasoline, he goes, and then boom, when he does it, the gasoline is so powerful, it sends him into orbit around the moon. And so that's the commercial. 3 commercials later, in the same pod, there is another ad for the gasoline. And in the background, you can see the moon is in the background, and you see Godzilla rotating around the moon while they do a completely different ad. And you just go, you people are off the chain brilliant.
What in comedy they call callback.
Yeah. Well, that little callback was just, and they would do that on everything they would do. And what happens, of course, Henry, you would know, is you start looking for them.
Yeah.
Right. You're looking for.
It's like the Tide commercial at the Super Bowl a couple of years ago, where every commercial was something about something else. It's not exactly a callback, but it's a reference to a previous version of the same commercial. No, this is a Tide commercial.
We come up with, catchy names for stuff like that now. So like we'd say it's sticky content that, people want to engage with, instead of just saying, well, we have recurring characters that people like want to know. Like, I think, so I heard you say, like a lot of the advertising now is bad. And I think that's one of those things that it's like every generation says the next generation's music sucks and whatever. Maybe. Like there's always been a bell curve of advertising. There was a lot of horrific advertising in the 70s and 80s.
And they're definitely, oh my God. Yeah.
When I was growing up. So it wasn't all, Cannes Lion winners. They can't always just all be Cannes Lion winners, right?
Oh, well, that's the very purpose of the Cannes Lion winners, is to say, you can do better, people. Look at look at when people do it right. No, I think you may be right, Henry. I think it may be a little bit of this sort of boomer Gen X in me, but I do know that the industry metamorphosed as a result of the sort of perfect storm of holding companies pulling off the top 15% of the money. So now you can't hire anybody or give anybody raises, along with
No,
the advent of Google and Facebook, which is just gutting the budgets. And so
Well,
at that
that and
point,
the ending of the media commission. I mean, when
yeah,
the media commission went away, I mean,
yeah,
there's no incentive
but
for
there's a ton of factors that, you know,
yeah.
a lot of it I put on, you know, clients in the golden age a lot of times were private companies. They were, you know,
yeah,
privately held
you
companies.
are
Now
exactly right.
now everybody responds to Wall Street, and you have to make your quarterly numbers, and it's all about, you know, nobody thinks long term anymore.
Yeah. And God
Um
help you
and,
if
and
private equity buys you.
and by the way, the agencies are also publicly held.
Yep.
You know, that you don't have this relationship between the CEO or the owner of a big brand and the agency president anymore. Like, we're
Yeah.
vendors, we're like down in the middle, like the people we report to are in the middle of the food chain as
Yeah.
opposed to at the top of the food chain on the
Yeah.
client side. So
The
there's
anecdote.
Well, Neil, let me get back to you. You landed the creative director said you need to come work for me. So you got yourself a creative
Yeah.
position. I'm going to say you were a junior copywriter or maybe just copywriter. Tell me how, because you've bounced around a bit. I met you in New York and you've gone back and forth between the two coasts and maybe you've done some stops elsewhere. So
Yeah.
tell us more about that.
Yeah. I spent a long time. Well, I shouldn't say, it's funny when you look back, you think it's such a long time. It turns out you were only there somewhere for like 2.5 years. But anyway, I was working for Saatchi and I was working largely on the Toyota business. And then I wound up going to Foot Cone and Belding down in Santa Ana, working on Mazda and working on Men's Health magazine. And Men's Health magazine was one of these little accounts that, because their audience was media people, the ads would run in Ad Age and Adweek. So even though it was a very, very small account, everybody in the business saw the ads we did. It was perfect. It was like social media that was targeted right to those people. So we won a bunch of awards off Men's Health, and that got me my job in Hong Kong. I became the executive creative director of Bates in Hong Kong, which was a regional thing. And the crazy thing was I went out there with an expectation that, they had hired me for my creativity, when in fact, after about, I would say about 3 months, I was virtually suicidal for being completely useless at this position. And my my boss, eventually I said to him, I go, Jeffrey, he was a Chinese boss, uh, really quite a brilliant character, a great politician. And I said to him, Jeffrey, I think I'm probably going to be the dumbest hire you've ever made. I don't seem to understand the nuance of the work that I'm being shown. And I fear that every time I make any kind of tweak to it, I'm only ruining it. It strikes me that I'm a little bit like a gorilla with a violin. The most you could hope for is that I just don't break it. And he laughs and he says, I didn't hire you to do the creative work or even to judge the creative work. You didn't? Then what am I doing here? And he says, look, you don't understand Southeast Asia. The Malays hate the Singaporeans. The Singaporeans hate the Indonesians. The South Chinese hate the Hong Kongers, and the Hong Kongers hate the Shanghainese. And then Beijingers hate the Shanghainese and the Hong Kongers. And the Taiwanese hate these people, and the
they all hate the
Philippines.
Japanese.
And they all hate the Japanese. And he said, what your purpose here is, they look at you like a well-meaning country bumpkin and they hate you less. So your job is to be the gasket between all of these hard surfaces. I use your stupidity as a barometer of who I can trust, because I watch the way they treat you. And knowing that you are sincere and unfortunately honest, I watch how they react to you. And then I know what's happening. And he showed me 2 or 3 examples of, they made this remark and then they said this when they didn't think you could understand, and blah, blah, blah. And now I know that those people are lying sacks of shit. Like, so that was 2 years of absolute agony, at which I learned the truth of this sentence told to me by an Anheuser-Busch guy who was over in Beijing. he says, we were commiserating about what it was like to be an American in China. And he says, you know, they have an idiom in Mandarin. It goes, when the Americans arrive, they have all the money and we know how things work. And when they leave, we have all the money and they know how things work. And the way I met this cat from AB was I was on an elevator in Lang Kwai Fong and, or a lift, as they would say there. And I'm 6'1", so everybody was like down here, except for this other Guilo, which means foreign devil. And he was likewise my tall. And I looked at him and I go, where are you from? And he goes, St. Louis. And I go, holy shit, man, let's get lunch. And because as soon as if you ever heard an American or a Canadian accent, you would be like, oh, we're taking the day off. You know, like we're going to go to the zoo. And that's when we commiserated on what it was like. I mean, honestly,
Well,
God, you just felt like such a fish out of water.
I'm starting to see the early seeds of the Neal Foard we are coming to know and love today. You had to play a vital but clearly uncomfortable role
Yeah.
in this position in Hong Kong, about which you knew nothing. I mean, if you hadn't asked that question of your boss 3 months into the gig, you know, you'd have been oblivious. But it also, I think, gave you some insights into, okay, I'm going to make the guess and say that this clarified, maybe didn't make you any happier, but it certainly clarified, you know, what you were doing there.
Yeah,
But I think some instincts kicked in for you. Am I guessing correctly there?
In a sense, I mean, you were absolutely right that, well, it clarified my position, but it didn't make me feel any better about being this rube who was being manipulated.
You were the worm on the hook.
Yeah,
you were the bait. Like
in a way, yeah, because they were playing a certain game, a kind of Game of Thrones, that was very high level, and they were, you know, which I was not up to. And so, as you describe, Henry, I think the worm on the hook is a very accurate portrayal of my status. Although, even that awful position to be in, people were quite stunningly gracious to me. People you wouldn't expect. People that seemingly didn't like you, and then you find out 3 years later when you meet some guy that you knew in Hong Kong on the street, and you say, "Oh my Lord," you know, like, you know, Ronald, what are you doing here? And then you sit down and you talk over a beer, and he says, "Oh yeah, you know, that guy backstopped you so many times. He threatened to quit when they badmouthed you at Hong Kong Bank." And I'm like, "What?" And he goes, "Oh yeah." And it's a demonstration of the limits of our understanding of what's happening around us. I don't think people fully appreciate. They don't have adequate respect for what they don't know.
I agree. I mentioned earlier, I don't even remember if it was before we started recording or not, that I did a lot of political commentary, and specifically it was in the area of Cuba and Cuban American relations. I'm a Cuban American. My parents fled communism. And one of the biggest things that I see, and it's specific in my case, but I think it's broadly applicable, is it's hard for people to understand that other people don't have your same motivations, background, desires, or ways of thinking. You know, so we ascribe to world leaders that they should do X, Y, and Z because that's the logical thing. Well, that's the logical thing for you, the American who has this, you know, like you can't assume that A, the person is sane, B, that their motives are honorable.
Yes.
Like we make a lot of assumptions about other people, and it happens, and I just happen to notice that, like in the world stage, like when we're looking at, you know, like what makes Putin tick, and you say, well, if I were Putin, well, but you're not Putin. Putin has his own set of values, his own way of thinking, his own experiences that and he might be a psycho on top of all that, right? Like, so we can't assume the rationality of other people around us. And the more kind of, you know, it's one thing to say, well, he's my neighbor and I kind of know the guy, but when you have this really big cultural differences, like you're in Hong Kong, you know, probably when you were working in that lumber yard, the last thing you ever thought you'd be working was as a creative director in an ad agency in
That's a
Hong
fact.
Kong, where you were a pawn in some sort of political game that you had no idea was even going on. Like, it's crazy.
You got that right, Henry. You've nailed it. If you had told me that was what the situation was going to be in just a few years, I would have said you are out your mind. And but let's go back to your point, which is really it's the nub of kind of, it's so much the handle on the industry of propaganda and PR and marketing. It's that you do not really understand somebody else's life experience. You cannot make too many assumptions about their motives. You can't make too many assumptions about what drives them. You don't know what kind of childhood someone has. The great tragedy of armed conflict is that the people fighting, the people doing the actual dying, were more likely to be friends than they ever were to be enemies. That they have vastly more in common with each other than they do the very leaders that have sent them in harm's way. And I remember discovering one day when I was reading I love to read old books, like 100-year-old books, because it's funny to me how similar human motives and how, the impulses are all the same. Like they speak in a kind of anachronistical, arcane language, but the impulses and the drives are just exactly the same. I find that very funny and entertaining. And I'm reading this account from a British officer who was an aviator who was taken captive by the Germans in World War I. And 1915, he is literally being housed in a castle with complete freedom of movement because he has made a gentleman's agreement that he will not attempt to escape. In other words, it was sufficient for him to offer his word of honor for his captors to say, well, then you may roam free through the castle grounds. Now, meanwhile, their own soldiers, they're living with rats climbing through their boots, and they could give two craps, right? Because he is an officer, therefore he is part of the...
Yeah.
We have more in common, this Englishman and I, than I do with my own soldiers. Okay,
Yeah.
so this is just a microcosm of the very way that we treat that companies treat their employees, companies treat their customers. The person at Delta Airlines checking you in has vastly more in common with you than they do with their own bosses. And so don't take it out on them, brother. They're just trying to help you as best they can under a system that is, who knows where their pressures are? Who knows what they've been told?
That's a fascinating observation, Neal, because I'm thinking about the fact that less than 100 years ago, in most inner cities, the owner of the business would live right next door to the people who worked for him.
Right. Well,
and the differences between the classes, that's how you want to use the descriptor.
Well, yeah, not to use a trigger word, but yeah,
was significantly less distinguishing than it is today.
Did you ever see that in Godfather 2? There's a marvelous scene where this mafiosi, the Black Hand, shows up to install his own nephew to work in this grocery store. And as a result, the grocery store owner has to let Don Corleone go.
He has to let him go. Yeah, he's got
to let him go.
Can him.
And it's a very, very sad scene because he's so sad, to have to let this boy go. And that's the relationship you're talking about, Howard, where somebody's actually crestfallen and destroyed that they have to let you go, as opposed to, well, it's third quarter and we all know what that means. It's time to spin the wheel. Welcome to the Hunger Games. Who will survive?
I read a headline 2 days ago, and you mentioned that you worked on the Toyota business, and I currently work on the Ford business, and just the headline I saw the other day from Stellantis, they have like a mandatory work from home day, and they use that day to lay off 400 people. So, they all got a Zoom call, presumably at a certain point in time in the day, and that's how they were told,
Yeah. So it's not advertising that has changed for the worse. It's just the work environment in general.
There's a lot of that. I will say that small business still preserves the human element. And
I haven't laid off anyone, at all. Of course, it's just me, but
But I mean, and we could take this down like a gazillion different alleyways, but
right.
part of it is, urbanization. We're all, you become a commodity, right? Like,
Yeah.
whereas when you
Yeah.
live in a small town in a rural area, one of those, John Mellencamp songs, um, people know each other and there's responsibility to each other, and you're not going to do something that's going to besmirch your family name. And
Yeah.
so there's, in this anonymity of the grind of the cities, and you're going to lose something, and we've definitely
well,
lost
but
something.
this may sound like we're kind of going off on a topic that we don't really discuss when we do our episodes, Henry, but it is, I think, exactly on point to what Neal has offered to the world. And well, I'm still curious to know, how you got from Hong Kong to where you are today. There's still a little bit more to tell. I'm seeing all these the points that don't seem to be connected are connecting for me, because there is a point of view and an attitude and a positivity about you that I've always admired, and I think the world has come to admire through the stories that you tell. And what does that have to do with the creative brief? It has everything to do with the creative brief, even though that's not what your gig is today. So we're not going down rabbit holes here with the direction our conversation is taking. I think this is all part and parcel to the story that's unfolding about our friend Neal Foard, my old buddy Neal Foard. So
Before you respond to that, Neal, I want to pile on and agree with Howard, because in the end, Howard and I have talked a lot about it in the brief, the target description. It's about having empathy with people that are not you. And I talk about, and Howard likes this, so I'm going to repeat it, but I say, I want that target description to be like a costume that the creatives can put on and walk around in and feel because the target audience isn't you. It's people that, and I think that's, by the way, that's one of the issues that we have in advertising, right? Like, advertising's made on the coasts in the big cities, and then it's broadcast to the middle of America where there's still a lot of people, and they look at that and they're like, what the fuck are we even looking at? Like, these people are living on another planet, and frankly we are. So I I'm fortunate because I work in US Hispanic, I work in multicultural advertising. So our clients, and even our creatives, are a lot more cognizant of the fact that they don't understand the target audience, our consumer, the US Hispanic, the person who was an immigrant or the child of an immigrant that grew up with a certain background. And so they're more open to, but when you're just doing general advertising and you're living in Manhattan and you think everybody, it's like the old Pauline Kael thing. It's like, I don't know anybody that voted for Nixon. Well, yeah, because your circle of friends on the Upper East Side or whatever, they're not everyday Americans. So I think empathy is a big thing.
The my grandfather was from Kentucky, and my experience with him was he was pretty racist, um, both in his language and his attitudes towards things. I can't say that he was a bad man, but he vibrated with that energy, with that anger that is quite typical of a sort of rural angry white man. And yet, I remember one day he lived in Bishop in his very late years, in Bishop, California. So he was up in the mountains, the Sierra Nevadas. And there was this African American family filling up their car, and I was terrified he was going to say something. And I was all of about 13 years old. This little African American gal, this little black girl, slips on the gas. That you know how filling stations have the gas, and she takes a little tumble, scrapes her knee, and he was incredibly sweet about offering her a hand up and saying, "Oh, I'm so sorry that happened to you." And he went and got a towel and just was the sweetest, most grandfatherly figure with her. And I thought, what am I watching? how is this possible? What it demonstrated to me, Henry, was people are unpredictable. You can't necessarily fit them into a nice tight, what the hell's the name of that? Oh, Myers-Briggs.
Yeah.
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 They just don't conform to the
Personality.
16, right? They just don't pack so sweetly into the nice little 16 boxes. That's just not how they are. They're weird. They are driven by very peculiar internal winds. For all I know, he was reacting off something from when he was 10 years old. And because he used to play with black kids all the time when he was back in Kentucky. I mean, he was not rich. And it triggered something. All of a
But
sudden he was
it's an interesting point you bring up, because there's also a context of situation, right? Like, a context of being a bystander watching a child fall, like child falling in that moment overrode like any kind
Yeah.
of political
Yeah.
law, you know what I mean? Like, so
I do know what you mean. That's what I'm trying to get at.
yeah, it's
That's what I'm
contextual.
trying to do out there in the world, is to say, if I can strip away down to the little human moment, my guess is we're all going to look at this the same way. So
Well,
really, go ahead.
where along the trajectory, Neal, did you start getting this inkling that there was something else that you wanted to do? I mean, you mentioned, I'm going to just come out and I
Got
haven't
laid off.
mentioned it yet.
That was what it was.
Well, yeah, you've got this new thing out called Storyfire,
Yeah.
where you are offering training and coaching and encouragement to all stripe of people, whether you're in the advertising business or not, and probably not especially if not necessarily for people in the ad business, to help them tell better stories, to build business, to build relationships, to connect with people
Yeah.
in any kind of environment. And you've been posting these kinds of stories on LinkedIn now for, I don't know how many years. A couple of years now, and you've got a huge following. And I also knew you when you transitioned from advertising into experiential advertising.
Yeah.
Which is kind of it's a division, it's an area within our
it's a specialty. It's like shopper marketing. It's its own art form. Yeah.
So but what I'm really curious to learn is, was this a slow boil that kind of you realized I needed to do something different? Or did you have an aha moment and saying, wait a minute, I think I need to take a left turn here? How did you get from your advertising creative director self to your storytelling self? Because you talk about how many hundreds or thousands of presentations that you made over the course of your career, which is the genesis of, I need to have a story to tell if I'm going to connect with these people, which I get. I haven't made nearly as many presentations as you have, but that's what I do for a living. I connect with people by training, by teaching, whether I'm standing in front of a group or I'm using the podcast or I'm writing. It's still about, how do I connect? And I can give them facts and figures, but it's when I tell an anecdote, that's when I know there's that human connection. So where along your trajectory did you start to see that this was a new possibility for you?
Well, pretty much everything that I've done in my career is accidental. I wish I wish I could take credit for being a very methodical and systematic person who had plotted a career. What I typically tended to do was to follow people I admired to wherever they were. So my good friend Matt O'Mara, who I admired greatly for his skill as an organizer, and he was very persuasive, and he wound up working in the events business. And with his encouragement, I joined him at a company called MC Squared, who had just fabulous management. God, they were so good. They were old-timey handshake guys that had come up as carpenters and plumbers and electricians in the, and when you go to, say, the Javits Center in New York or the Moscone Center in San Francisco, that the people that come in and build your displays for giant trade shows, auto shows and so forth. Well, I mean, you got to cut lumber and you got to turn wrenches and install stuff. And these were guys that used to do that as their careers. And then over time, they became the managers of their own companies, and then onto the, so they were building billion-dollar companies when they started out as a journeyman carpenter. And I just loved these guys. They were handshake guys. If they made an agreement with you, no courtroom in the world was going to, no lawyer was going to persuade them not to live up to their end of the bargain. It was really old fashioned. It was not private equity. It was guys who said, that's what I told them I'd do, so I'm going to do that, and they were just the sweetest. They just looked and sounded like they were right out of The Sopranos, and you will never meet nicer guys in your life. They were so cool.
And I think that's when I reconnected with you in California and invited you to come to my classroom and talk about,
that's right,
what you do.
Yeah. And as it happens, they're great fans of storytelling. They would love to be able to say, okay, let me take you on a journey. You were at the airport, you walk into this private lounge, and they would say, a gossamer cotton thin, thing wafts in the side, driven by a breeze that's unseen, but nevertheless persistent through the day. The temperature is this such, you can smell jasmine. And they were, despite their accents, their North Jersey accents, they were brilliant at telling these stories. And so we were sort of kindred spirits. We all got along. You can imagine how much fun it would be to be with a crew like that down in Orlando, tying one on after the install, right? Just howling with laughter over some, thank God they would tell me the greatest tales about adventures in the Middle East, because they would do like an installation in the UAE or in Dubai, and the troubles that arose from misunderstandings. Oh my God. That was Howard. I think that's where, even though I had sort of made my bones in advertising, in new business pitches, and telling stories on behalf of clients, it was when I was in live events when I really started to feel like this is something that you could really make something into. You could make something out of this. Because to listen to them was, there's Rene Rodriguez, who's this magnificent author. He wrote a book called Amplify. It's about having more influence in the workplace and in life. And in it, he makes the observation, he says, look, you and I both know that during the day, your mind wanders. Even in the middle of watching a presentation, you're sitting there daydreaming. Could be about like, oh, did I forget to put on deodorant? Or, it's any number of things that your mind wanders in the middle of watching somebody else's presentation. But that stops as soon as they start telling a story. And the reason is, in your mind, you were daydreaming and you were telling a story in your mind. But as soon as they start telling you a story, their story becomes your story. In other words, now you're daydreaming, but they're the ones supplying the dream. And
that's cool.
Isn't that, but you can see the truth of that. You go, oh my God, he's right. You can see the truth of it. This is why, for example, that when men are watching TV, it's almost impossible to carry on a conversation with them because they're inside the TV. They are completely occupied by that. If they're interested in it, they're 100%.
Yeah, it's about being invested in the story, right? Like if you're watching a movie and it's horrible and you're not invested in it, but generally we're not masochists that sit there watching things like that. Good TV is the TV that you get invested in, and you're not going to be scrolling through your phone.
No, definitely not.
Because
I learned early on that you could not call my dad in the middle of a Green Bay Packer football game, even if they were losing.
Yeah, because he's invested in it.
But he didn't understand the concept of multitasking. He just didn't understand it.
Well, God bless him.
Yeah, it doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. You're either paying attention to one thing or the other.
So there you go. Howard, you just put
your finger, or
Henry, you just put your finger on it. You're either doing this or that.
Yeah. I always remembered a Native American proverb. I think it was, I'm not positive of the origins. I say from Cherokee, but I could be wrong. But the line is this: tell me a fact and I will learn. Tell me a truth and I will believe. Tell me a story and it will live forever in my heart. Yeah. And that's what you're doing. That's what you're doing when you tell a story.
That's what I'm trying to do. My great motive actually is not to sell the Storyfire course. I'm doing that to make the rent. The fact is, I grew addicted to people saying this meant something to me. Like that story made me cry. I get the nicest invitations from people. They'll be in Duluth or they'll be in Boca Raton, and they'll say, hey, if you're ever in Shreveport, give me a holler, man. I'd love to buy you a beer. And just to know that I've gotten the invitation it's just so restorative to the soul. You know, everybody does things for various incentives. And what I discovered was how that sensation of making a connection with another human being, how expensive that was. Or no, what's the word I'm looking for? How much money that was worth to me. Like it was the equivalent of making a lot of money.
Yeah.
And the beauty of it is, I'm not famous. I can go places and not be recognized. Nobody's going to bother me at dinner. But I do have I have one of the benefits of a celebrity in that there is a very, very small group of people who look forward to the next video.
Yeah.
It's kind of a perfect place to be, where no, I'm not getting rich, and no, I'm not famous, but neither am I pestered, and nobody's coming to me with their hands out. They're just
Good stuff, Henry.
Good stuff, Howard.
He's Henry Gomez.
And he's Howard Eibach, and together we're the Brief Brothers. Till next time.